So today, we are going to be proving the Bible. Now, if you think that's impossible, well, you're wrong. So, overview. We're going to be doing 3 things today. Firstly, why modern scientific, I put that in quotes for good reason, atheism is wrong. Then bad arguments for the Bible. And finally, we're going to be proving the Bible. So firstly, scientific atheism. So, we have what's called the 5 Geneses. Now, if you've never heard of them before, I expect you to have not heard of it before. It's essentially that when people tell you that matter only needed to inexplicably pop into existence once, they're wrong. There needs to be 5 inexplicable instances in modern scientific atheism. That would be cosmogenesis, which is a fancy word for the Big Bang, baryogenesis, which is essentially how matter came into existence, and then there are 3 different steps to evolution which would need to inexplicably happen. So firstly, we have cosmogenesis, aka the Big Bang. So the Big Bang theory states that at a point in time, roughly 15 billion years ago, all matter just popped into existence out of nothing. Now that makes no sense. So the justification for this is about 15 billion years ago is that quantum fluctuations, which is a word that they before had never used, it was completely made up just for this, caused the universe to exist. These fluctuations would have had to have 4 properties. A, not in the universe in time. B, they have to have the ability to act on the universe. C, they have to be unchanging. And D, they have to have the ability to create something out of nothing, which if it's just a force of the universe, completely violates 2 important scientific laws, which you may have learned about in physical science or physics. It violates the second law of thermodynamics and the conservation of energy. Okay, so what they will say to justify that is if the universe is infinite, then everything would have always existed, which is true. Everything would have always existed. But that doesn't work because of what's called the domino chain, right? If you have a chain of dominoes, it is falling in the middle of the chain, right? So you can imagine it like this. If you are eating pasta, and then a random stranger walks up to you and sees you eating pasta, and they just assume that you have been eating pasta for all of time, forever and ever and ever, that makes no sense. They're probably crazy. So why would it be any different with the universe? Of course it had to begin at some point in time, just like a domino chain. A domino chain has to have a first domino. Okay, so baryogenesis, the origin of matter. Now we're going to go for complicated quantum mechanics. If you've never heard of a quantum mechanic before, you probably never have, and you probably never will after today. But we're going to do it anyways. So energy can transform into what's called a matter-antimatter particle pair. Think E equals mc squared, right? So if you don't know what antimatter is essentially the same thing as matter, but the opposite. Has the same mass, same amount of weight, same everything, except it's opposite. So when they touch each other, they just explode and create a bunch of energy. That's where E equals mc squared comes from, because energy can transform into mass, and vice versa. It's also like 0 equals -1 plus 1, right? Energy is 0, -1 is antimatter, and 1 is matter. So they come together and they explode and make 0 matter, which is energy. So let's just assume that the Big Bang happened, right? Then all the energy would have split into equal amounts of matter over here and antimatter over here. However, they would have exploded immediately after forming because matter and antimatter explode when they touch each other or get anywhere near each other. However, we exist, which means they didn't explode, because then we'd be exploded today, and that would not be good. So, after the Big Bang, there would have been nothing. And that may have been happening for a long time, after the Big Bang for the next 15 billion years. There may have been more explosions, but there would still be nothing other than just a bunch of explosions. So this is actually a big problem in quantum mechanics called baryonic asymmetry, which is just a fancy word meaning there's more matter than antimatter, which no physicist has a solution for, but I have a solution. God, specifically in big, bold, capital letters. So, now we're going to be going on to the rest, which is evolution. So, abiogenesis is how life came from not life, or nothing. Modern science will tell you that this just happened, and a pool of chemicals just magically transformed into a cell. That doesn't make sense either. I think we're seeing a pattern. It just doesn't make sense. So essentially this says that a puddle came to life. Yes. So consirogenesis from there is a made-up word. I made that up. But it essentially is how life started to think. It is believed that at some point life just started thinking. But how? And when? Science can't really answer this. Again, modern scientific atheism makes no sense. So from there we have anthropogenesis, which is how animals became human. Now, I understand that monkeys in evolution did not transform into humans directly, but it's still a good example that we can use. So let's say we have some monkeys, right? Now these monkeys have monkey babies, and those monkey babies have more monkey babies. Now what are you left with? Monkey babies. They're not a different animal. Some might be taller than some other ones. Some might have slightly different fur coats, but they're all still monkeys. No matter how many times these monkeys have monkey babies, those monkey babies are still going to be monkeys. So how did our last common ancestors with monkeys become human? Again, it just doesn't make sense. So other problems with evolution include the lack of these common ancestors in the fossil record. So said common ancestors, there's no fossils for them. We have no actual evidence that they existed. And another thing called irreducible complexity. So if you look at your neighbor's eyeball, for instance, you can see that your neighbor's eyeball is very, very complex. Now, that complexity has so many parts that if you were just to take out one part, it wouldn't work. You wouldn't be able to see. So how did it evolve over time if you take it out, doesn't work? It has to have a simpler step, but the simpler step isn't possible. So another final thing is it contradicts the Bible. See, the Bible has birds being created before dinosaurs, but according to evolution, birds evolved from dinosaurs. So there's an innate contradiction just right there. So bad arguments for the Bible. Don't use them because it's not going to work. So firstly, the fine-tuned argument, which is a correct argument, don't get me wrong. However, there are so many objections that people will use that it's not really worth bringing up. So it says that the universe is too perfect for human existence just to be a coincidence. Now, that is true. I completely agree with that statement, but there is an easy objection to this that people will use, and that is if the universe is infinite. See, if the universe is infinite, well then, anything that can happen will happen. You can imagine it like this. How many numbers are there, right? There's an infinite amount of numbers. There's also an infinitely large amount of number line. So, all those numbers can fit in the number line. So therefore, there's an infinite amount of possibilities for the universe, and if there's an infinite universe, they can all fit. But you'd think that makes sense, but as we already talked about, an infinite universe doesn't make sense. Because infinite regression, which is essentially the same thing as that spaghetti example, right? You can't just go back in time forever, because there has to be a first thing to happen. Time just can't always go back. So then we have the argument from miracles. It goes like this. If a miracle occurs, then there is God. Okay? Then I guess that's true, but an atheist would say that these miracles are just scientific processes yet to be explained. Now, because this naturally comes from a place of ignorance, which essentially means that it comes from the idea of, oh, we just don't know, you can't prove it wrong. So then we have the God of the gaps fallacy. This is a famous one, actually. So it goes like follows. We don't know how something works, therefore God is what makes it work. This is just wrong. That would be like saying, if you don't know how gravity works, you see an apple fall from the tree, and you just say, oh, God pushed it down the tree. No, that's ridiculous. So, and then we have ontogenetic depth, which essentially means saying that God exists because of complexity. Now, this is a little different than our eye example because it has to do with evolution as well. The argument goes as follows. Because all things are complex, all living things that is, it must have always been complex, and therefore evolution is wrong. Well, this doesn't work because there's no unit to measure complexity like we have the units to measure other things. For instance, you have a meter stick to measure length. You have a scale to measure weight. But there is nothing to measure complexity with. There's no way to measure it, and therefore this doesn't work. Okay, and finally, we're going to prove the Bible. Okay, So first we have the documental proof. Documental is a fun word to say, I will say, yeah. So most ancient texts believed to be legitimate, that is, ancient texts which we say are real and hold actual weight, usually have less than 20 extant manuscripts, which means that we have less than 20 old documents from around the time they existed. And even the best only to have 50 to 700 manuscripts. That may seem like a lot, but think about how many copies of Harry Potter are alive today. Tens of thousands. So we can think, oh, well, tens of thousands of those copies probably existed back then, but we have very few of them actually remaining. These include the Iliad, which is you may read if you are in 8th grade, and the works of the Greek philosopher Euripides. However, even the early of these are from several hundred years after the original was created. So that would be like you writing a book today, and then 1,000 years from now, the earliest copy of the book we have is only 700 years old. There's a 300-year gap where there was no books, right? So you're just missing a lot. And they also have lots of errors. Lots and lots and lots. On the other hand, the New Testament has just under 6,000 extant manuscripts. If we look at 6,000, and we look at like 20, there's a big difference there. And the earliest of these preserved documents is only from a century after they were originally written, which is a very, very short time frame. Moreover, on average, these documents only have about 71 errors each, but most of these are just typos. So that would be like, oh, a scribe forgot a letter, or a scribe misspelled a word, or a scribe wrote the same word twice. And that combined with the fact of imperfect translations amounts to only a handful of errors, about 5, in each document. Now that may seem like it's still bad, but none of these actually affect the overall message of the document. Okay, so now here we have a nice fancy little chart. So on top we have the New Testament, and you can see blue represents the earliest document we have, and the darker blue represents the amount of documents we have in tens. So look at that. The earliest document of the New Testament we have, very short time frame, very, very short. Then we have tons of documents. Old Testament, not quite as good, but it's older, so we should expect that. Slightly longer period of time, but still shorter than all the other ones other than the New Testament. And more documents than all the other ones, except for the New Testament. The Iliad, which is a famous book of poetry and Greek mythology from many thousands of years ago, the oldest copy we have is from 1,500 years after it was written. That's a long time if you ask me. And we have very few copies of it available. Only about 100, 200. Then we have Euripides, right? These are the works of this ancient Greek philosopher. They're not too bad, only a couple hundred years, right? But we have very, very few actual documents.
I was writing 100.
And then we have the average, right? The average document we have about a millennia after it was first written. That's a long time. That means that you wrote the book, and the oldest version we have was from 1,000 years after you wrote it. That's a long time. And look how many documents there are. Can't even see the amount of documents. There's actually about 20, whereas the rest of these have like a couple hundred. So we have TAG. It's a fun game to play, but it also is an abbreviation for the transcendental argument of God, for the existence of God, rather. Basically, it says that because we have logic and reasoning and morals and such, God must exist. Essentially, if there is no God, why is murder wrong? There's nothing to tell you that murder is wrong, so why is it wrong? So you might not like murder, but can you really say that it's wrong if God doesn't exist? And the answer is no, but obviously murder is wrong, so God must exist. Okay, next thing, the Jesus argument. Jesus argument just sounds funny, but no, it's a legitimate argument. So Jesus is the critical point of Christianity. If Jesus isn't who the Bible says he is, then the entire Bible is wrong. But if Jesus is who the Bible says he is, then the entire Bible is right. We know that Jesus existed because many sources other than the Bible talk about him, such as Roman documents of his crucifixion and the Hebrew historian Josephus from the 1st century. So But we also know that Jesus must have risen from the dead, because if he didn't rise from the dead, why would the disciples die for his cause? See, it doesn't make sense. Some people say that the disciples stole the body, but why would they steal the body, know it's not true, and then die for it? It's not right. Now you might say, oh, the Romans or the Pharisees stole the body. Well, if the Romans stole the body, that doesn't make any sense, because that only led to the further collapse of the Roman Empire and the Roman society. So they didn't want the body to be stolen. And the Pharisees didn't want the body to be stolen either, because they were enemies of Jesus. They didn't want to make it look like he was God. So, and now you might say that Jesus didn't really die. He just escaped from the tomb. Okay. Dead argument, right? Take that. So when Jesus was crucified, you had a professional Roman killer, what's called an executioner, who killed him. They whipped him, beat him, flogged him, put him on a cross, and then just to make sure that he was dead before they took him down, they stabbed him through the side with a spear. A bunch of water came out, which means that he had already asphyxiated, which essentially means that he couldn't breathe anymore. And then they took him down from the cross. He had to fake his death throughout the entirety of this, right? And then they buried him in the tomb, covered him with 90 pounds of linen clothes. It's a lot of pounds of linen if you're dead or almost dead. So, and then they put him in the tomb. So from there, he would have had to recover from all his injuries in less than 3 days, because it was on the 3rd day. And then he'd have to have the ability to take off those clothes. He'd have to regenerate his strength enough to do that. Then roll over a giant boulder, and then beat up 2 Roman guards and escape. Even a healthy person couldn't beat up 2 Roman guards and escape. So I'm going to ask you this. How could Jesus, with all those wounds, after having faked his death, which, might I add, would be really impressive, how would he escape and beat up 2 Roman guards? The point is, he wouldn't have been able to. It's ridiculous. And frankly, I'd be really impressed if they could do that. Okay, so then we have the argument from degree. It doesn't mean degree as in like Fahrenheit or Celsius, different kind of degree. So things have details, right? Which describe them. For instance, if we take this shirt that I'm wearing, it is black, but it is not completely black. Well, therefore we know that something must exist which has the most amount of possible black, right? So there is something that has every single possible detail to the extreme, and which we know when God created everything, right? After the first 6 days, he always said, it was good. It was good. So that means that we know that because God is good, he's completely good, every single detail of creation must have been in him to the extreme. He must have had every single detail of that goodness completely. So therefore, God exists. Okay, then we have Occam's razor, or Occam's razor. You can pronounce it either way. So Occam's razor says that if you have to choose between 2 theories, the one that makes the least amount of assumptions is usually right. So yeah, that makes sense, right? If you have a random pie, it can be any flavor you want. So just imagine craving that one flavor of pie that you really love. Now you could have it sitting out right here, right? There could be 2 theories how it got into existence. Either A, somebody baked it, or B, it just magically popped into existence right there, which would be really cool if it happened, but it's not going to happen. Which one makes the least amount of assumptions? The first one, right? Because that just makes sense. The other one doesn't. The first one doesn't really assume anything other than that there was somebody to bake it. The second one assumes that it could just magically pop into existence. The first one makes the least amount of assumptions. So likewise, which makes the least amount of assumptions? The first one is that something can come alive from nothing, monkeys can turn into people, and that something can come from nothing. Or God. I think I know which one makes the least amount of assumptions, and that would be God, right? The other one just makes a lot of assumptions, and it doesn't make sense.